The Cuban Missile Crisis took place during October of 1962.
The United States, Cuba, Italy, Turkey, and the Soviet Union were the countries that were involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis.
The key people that were involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis were John F. Kennedy, Fidel Castro, and Nikita Khrushchev. A few things that might have led to this event were the Soviet Union started building missile sites in Cuba in 1962. Another cause for the war was that Castro took power in Cuba and he took the private property from those companies and made it the property of Cuba to use as Castro decided. What happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis is Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier at the time, saw an opportunity to strengthen the relationship between the Soviet Union and Cuba and promised to defend Cuba from the US. In May 1960, Khrushchev began to ship ballistic missiles into Cuba and technicians to operate them. He believed that President Kennedy was weak and wouldn't react to the Soviets' operation. On October 22, 1962, after extensive consultation with his foreign policy and military advisors, Kennedy blocked Cuba. Both sides stood on the brink of nuclear war, but Khrushchev surrendered 6 days later and the missiles were dismantled. In return, Kennedy secretly agreed to remove U.S. missile sites in Turkey. How the Cuban Missile Crisis affected the Cold War was it brought the whole world to the brink of nuclear war and caused big tension between very powerful people and places in the world and put both the US and Soviet Union at a standoff, but ultimately were able to make a peace treaty. Significant because it was one of the scariest moments due to the uncertainty whether the whole world would encounter a nuclear war, which would have wreaked havoc on the areas affected and killed many people as well.
The leaders engaged in a 13-day political and military standoff because of the installation of nuclear-armed Soviet missiles in Cuba. On October 22, 1962, President John Kennedy notified Americans about the missiles. He explained his decision to enact a naval blockade around Cuba and made it clear that the U.S. wasn't prepared to use military force if necessary. In 1894 and 1971, the United States eventually agreed with the Soviet leader to remove the missiles, if the United States agreed not to invade Cuba.
How the world leaders could have responded differently is they all could have responded a bit calmer and taking consideration the civilians when almost following through a nuclear war. Because if they did go through a nuclear war, the whole world would feel the effect of it, and most likely many people, especially innocent civilians, would be killed, and also the nuclear weapons could have impacted our planet in a bad way, with toxic materials being spread around the globe. With everything considered, they should have really taken in consideration about the consequences of going to war with nuclear weapons and tried to be passive and non-hostile rather than aggressive when trying to come up with a solution. And also they should have tried their best to cooperate with one another, even through highly tense times, instead of trying to use nuclear warfare to resolve problems and putting people's lives in jeopardy. John F. Kennedy even said, "We will not prematurely or unnecessarily risk the cost of worldwide nuclear war, in which even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth, but neither will we shrink from that risk at any time it must be faced."
A long-lasting effect of this event was the relations between Cuba and the Soviet Union, which ended on shaky ground for some time after Khrushchev's removal of the missiles. As Fidel Castro accused the Russians of backing down from the Americans and deserting the Cuban Revolution, European allies of the United States were also angered not because of the U.S. stance during the crisis, but because the Kennedy administration kept them virtually in the dark about negotiations that might have led to an atomic war. The United States and Soviet Union signed an agreement to end above-ground testing in 1968. Both nations signed a non-proliferation treaty. The Soviet Union was led to a massive military buildup. Lessons that can be learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis are that we need to be more empathetic. It's a possibility that it will reduce danger, and both sides should have done something right then and there to reduce this from ever happening again.
Although the Cuban Missile Crisis was a pretty tough situation, the U.S. managed to survive and is continuing to flourish prior to that scary event.